Um, I am Dr. Curlietz, and I am an art historian who primarily works in modern and contemporary art, and I teach at Susquehanna University. But today I am sharing with you an activity that I've developed that I think will probably help students rethink objects and information that they receive within art history classrooms and sort of information that they're gathering on their own as they go throughout a course and are learning new material. And so here I have on the screen what that template looks like for the activity that I have in mind. So as some background context, some information to share. In several of my classes, I try to develop activities and assignments that ask students to contextualize um, sort of the objects that they're looking at or think about the larger historical and social relationships between objects and people or objects and artists specifically. And so I really feel like this template might help in that regard. And what I found as I was like thinking about this particular uh, process and sort of the way that I think about artworks as an art historian is that there are sort of layers of context that I want students to understand. And so I was looking for examples of different models, sort of spheres of contextual information or the way that we sort of organize information in our brains. And what I found is that many fields, especially those within the social sciences, and I'm very socially based in my art history practice, they've adopted different models to demonstrate different contextual spheres that individual actors or even data sets inhabit. So these systems that scholars have come up with, often they will adopt monikers such as a three-sphere model. And although each version highlights different information depending on the field or the scholar who is sort of developing the model, right? So, for example, there's a researcher, Rivka Tuval Maisich, which I think is how you pronounce that scholar's name, who that particular researcher is talking about analyzing sort of texts and narratives, and they may highlight spheres, for example, that start off with the immediate intersubjective relationships, more collective social environments, and then perhaps broader cultural meaning systems or meta narratives. And these are sequentially larger bands that radiate out from a central point. So another version of the model may focus on spheres such as knowledge or action or information, right? And so like thinking about what information we put in each of those different categories is really helpful for students, I think, right? So the activity that I've outlined here is based loosely on this model, and it can be used in a variety of humanities contexts, although my primary intention for it was for it to be used within an art history classroom. Often when talking with students, my goal is to show them or have them suss out the web of connections that impact the creation and reception of an artwork. So too often I find that students focus on the micro level, things like what did an artist mean when they created the object? Why did they personally create it? And I've looked for ways to push them past this immediate context to look at larger economic and social impacts that may have affected the finished product. For example, what is going on in the scene? What other actors and institutions were necessary to realize the final image? What political events might have influenced the artist to push boundaries and represent new subjects? So the template that I've created serves as a visual reminder for students of the contextual information needed to craft a well-rounded discussion of any given object or historical event. So this is how it could be used in a variety of other humanities contexts. So here, as you can see on the screen, we start small with the immediate artist, right? Here I have very little, just a little blip about Manet and the fact that the object that we've chosen to highlight here that we're focusing this information session on is Manet's Bar at the Folies Bergère, which was made in 1882. And so the little tidbit that I have shown here under the artist sort of sphere of influence is a reminder that he died a year later. So this is, sort of later on in his life, later on in his career, which is good context to have, right? As we're thinking about the direct impact of the artist's life on this object. Of course, there are so many other things we could put here. We could think about, like sort of where he lived, his family life, right? His relationship to the next sphere, which is the subject, to the things that he's depicting, right? So all those things can be placed under the artist sphere, right? Now, we go a little further out. We talk about the subject, right? Here's where I would encourage students to describe the object at hand, the subject depicted within, and go beyond the obvious to think about the larger subject category. So, for example, here I have notes on Manet's infamous model, Victorine Marant, alongside discussions of even the types of bottles that are depicted in the painting and their connection to historic beverages at the time, right, and how they were produced. Another student may bring in a poster, like you see here, advertising the concert hall he portrayed. So really sort of just gathering that slew of information within a specific category and get a feel for the diversity of those things, right? And lastly, on this outermost ring, right, we have local information about the work's geographic location and areas where it may have been displayed. Could be really helpful as well. So here you see an image of the salon that Manet exhibited the work in originally in 1882. We also have a map of Paris from the same year, which shows some key monuments that appeared scattered throughout the city, and even an article on a market crash that happened in Paris in that year, where banks needed to be bailed out, of all things, which we can only assume might have led people to need distraction going to a concert hall like the one that is depicted in his painting, his famous painting. So all of these different things can be really helpful, obviously, for understanding why a piece comes to be, why a piece like this might have been painted in the first place, and the impact that it had, right? Now, while this is a template, like I said, for perhaps an in-class activity, and maybe even assigning specific student groups to be in charge of different spheres, and then maybe to come back together and to sort of help each group inform more complex discussions with each other. I also think that this could be really valuable for students planning research papers. So as an individual activity, I'm a very visual person. And so sometimes it can feel really overwhelming when even I, as a scholar, start to approach a new topic and you find yourself going down rabbit holes and it's hard to understand like where you've been and where you're going. And like, what am I going to do with all this information that I have gathered? Where are the holes in my research thus far? And so by having a layout, something like this, a template that exists, you could use it for students to understand, like, where am I focusing my research energies? Where are the gaps in my research? How can I further expand the discussion that I'm having and create a more well-rounded argument, right? So I think this also could prompt students to fill in the gaps in that way in their own research. But that all to say, I do think that depending on the type of class that you have, the level of the course, these different spheres could be reimagined to include different types of information. Obviously, for an artwork, that kind of information is going to be very specific. We could even include a band that talks about materials, right? Thinking about, what types of materials the artist used, where those materials come from, what are the associations with those materials? For example, if you have an artist who in the 21st century is choosing to paint using egg tempera, a very historic material, that's a choice, right? And it has a lot of historic associations and relationships to other kinds of things that we should be cognizant of, right? So perhaps another ban for something like materials or sort of the physical aspect of the object could be really helpful. But using this for something like a historic event could also be very productive. For example, having the immediate actors who participated in that event being at the center, sort of like the location and maybe the political context being towards the middle, and maybe having a larger sort of like the fallout or what effect that historical event had in subsequent years as like a later ring. I don't know. There are many ways in which this kind of model could perhaps help students to think about multiple spheres of information and additional contexts that could produce more interesting and complex conversations.